Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Stedman podcast. We're so excited to be back on with you with another episode. And joining me today is my co-host, Micah. Micah, how are you doing?
Man, I can't believe it's Monday already, but I'm good. How are
Mm.
you?
Well, it's Holy Week, so I guess I'm doing good than like most people do on Holy Week. It is like people always ask me like what's it like working at a church during big religious holiday seasons, and it's like running a triathlon, and you're
I
not
think it
even
depends on the church,
well.
right?
I think it depends on the church. It also depends on I think it depends on a lot of other things, but I'm not really sure. Um, I'm not really sure, because I think in cases whether you're a small church or big church pastor, there's always a bit of busyness and stress that comes with Holy Week. Not just planning for Easter and your Monday. And if you're a church that does like Monday, Thursday services, Good Friday services, and even Easter. And if you have multiple Easter services that you do, like I think there's a lot of stress that goes into that. But then, I mean, I know one church that for their Easter service, they would always rent out the expo center in town, because if they were to do an Easter service at their church, they'd have to do like 8 or 9 services. But then they can go do
Mhm.
3 services at the expo center because they have more seating and they have more adequate parking in their. So that's always, and plus, they're able to do probably a lot more stuff in an expo center than they can do necessarily in their church due to the space and the height of the building. And if they can do like super big fog machines and whatever, better sound, better lights, because they have all that room. So yeah.
Well, I guess what I was referring to is that, you know, lead pastor Scott Stedman having to do everything at a smaller church versus associate pastor Scott Stedman now doing children's and family ministry. You know, it's probably not nearly as stressful. I mean, I know it is stressful, but does it make sense?
Yeah, it does, and it's a whole different ball game. Like what I have to do this week, because this week we still have our confirmation class, even though it's Easter. We still have our confirmation class, mainly because the way the spring break schedule was, and everybody leaves for spring break. It was like, okay, like I can't afford to miss another day because there's so many topics I need to cover for confirmation. So we're going to have a confirmation class on Easter. Plus, having a confirmation class on Easter, I know everybody's probably going to be there because there's nothing happening on Easter. There's no sports practice. There's no, it's kind of one of those religious holidays that nobody's doing anything except for like visiting family. But even if like, hey, we're having confirmation class, then they're going to be like, oh, okay, we can just kind of roll with it. So, yeah, so that's kind of it with that. But I mean, I have a family Monday, Thursday service I'm planning. That's only an hour, and I already have it planned. I just have to get some supplies for it and get that ready. Um, and then that's the thing. Like, I don't know if I have to be part of the Good Friday service or not. Usually, it's a smaller service, and usually the lead takes over that. But still, staff meeting Tuesday, I could find out that I'm going to be involved in a lot of things that I didn't know I was going to be involved in. So you never know. So yeah, so that's pretty much Easter for a lot of people, what that looks like. So since we're talking about Easter and running wild on Easter, stories gone wild, Micah, do you have one?
Yeah, I had two, and I'll save I'll save the one. Uh, I had quite an eventful morning, but I'll save that one for another time. Uh, I shared that I have uh, recently finished my master's degree, and so I've begun the process of applying for jobs. And so
Mm.
you know what that's like, and so it's just like attach a resume, write a cover letter, attach a resume, write a cover letter, get a bunch of rejection emails, and they say that
Yeah.
like I think it's like an 80% investment on your return to like for every 80 applications you may get an interview kind of thing.
Yeah.
So a couple months back I applied for this job and hadn't heard anything, and my wife and I are on our way to an appointment last I think Tuesday or Wednesday, and I get an email and it's from the search committee. And the email says, "Dear Mr. Current, thanks for applying for this position. Can you confirm that you have a bachelor's degree and 3 years of post baccalaureate experience?" And every fiber of my being tried not to return that, like reply to that email, be a smart aleck or whatever, right? So
Yeah.
what made me laugh the most, or mad, whatever, I don't really know what emotion that went along with that, um, was the fact that when you apply for a job at this particular place, you have to put your highest level of education accomplished. Like you have to check doctorate, master's, bachelor's, high school diploma, GED, whatever. And my resume says master's degree awarded, bachelor's degree awarded. And it's like, you can't get a master's degree without a bachelor's degree, right? And so, like, you can't get a PhD without a master's degree. It's like, it's crazy. And so people were like, me and my wife were just like laughing because it's like people just don't read these days, whether it's a cover letter, whether it's a resume, um, you name it. The idea that we just thought it was funny because it's like I've been working in at least higher ed for 8 years, but like I've been working since I was in my early 20s. And
Mhm.
so to think, and not like you put your birthday in your resume or anything like that, but like it's just hilarious that you can't get a bachelor's degree without a master, or I'm sorry, you can't have a master's degree without a bachelor's degree. And so if you read my resume and read the application, you can see that I have a resume. So, or I'm sorry, a master's degree.
Yeah. It's it's
The
one of
job
those.
hunt in
Yeah. It's
2024.
well, I think it's one of those things where if you are applying for a position, whether it's a whether it's a church position or whether it's just a regular job, that the people who are hiring you would at least take the decency to really read over your resume to be able to see, hey, because the most common thing is if I submit my resume, you should automatically know what my education is because that's something I have to
Mhm.
put on there. And sometimes it's hard, and I think the hard part I have, especially with churches, is because since I'm so, or at least not necessarily me, but some pastors are very versatile. They're lead pastors, they're children's pastors, they're youth pastors, and they kind of move throughout different positions in the church. It's almost like, well, I can apply to this church job for this family pastor thing, but I was a lead pastor at the last church, but the church before that I was a family pastor. So okay, and sometimes it's like, oh, this person's a lead, and then they ask you questions like, well, you're a lead pastor, what makes you think you want to do family ministry? And it's like, because I have experience as a family minister. I was working at this church for like 3 years as a lead, but I had 10 years of being a family minister that was right below that point. But since I'm putting the most current thing first, because you have to, because if you put, oh yeah, I'm a family minister, it's like, oh well, there's a 7-year gap. What were you doing in those 7 years? So it's one of those things where as somebody's applying for jobs, you always make sure you're trying to put the best representation of who you are and your credibility and your credentials forward. And yet you have people who are hiring, and it's almost like when they do something like that, it's almost like, do I really want to work here now? because it's
Yes.
really telling me that you don't really pay attention to details and you just kind of assume stuff. Or if I didn't reveal something, the fact that you're asking me to reveal something really shows that, oh, well, you may be interested in me, but if I didn't have the credentials you're asking for and you're asking me for them, then do you even really know what you're looking for?
Yeah.
Or are you at this point now you're desperate and you're willing to take anybody now to fill this position?
Yeah. There's a number of ways you could look at it. Yeah, I just, it's funny you mentioned the different, years of experience and people like going different position to position. But like, um, it's interesting the generational thing, like the generation before us, like a lot of folks, I've shared that I've worked at Miami numerous times on this podcast, but like there are people that we know that work at Miami that have worked there for 20, 30, 35, 40 years, and they have a high school diploma and they don't have they don't have a bachelor's degree, or they have a bachelor's degree and they don't have a master's degree. And they're making double and triple the money that we are, as people who were told, hey, you have to go to school and you have to get a master's degree. And now the job qualifications, like there was a job posted last week that I saw. It was a director's position in one of the buildings on campus, and they wanted a PhD. I'm like, for that, it's crazy how the difference of 20, 20, 25, 30 years has shifted the expectations of what, you know, job
Yeah.
expectations are.
Yeah. So my story's gone wild. It's a bit interesting because I was thinking about like things, like kind of things that people say. And you're kind of at that point where you don't really know like where they're even getting this from or why they're saying certain things. So it was one of the first churches I ever worked at. And we had a thing that every fifth Sunday we would just have a meal together as a church.
Mm-hmm.
And then that was always good because then usually people would invite their friends so that they can kind of see what the church was like, and then also they get a meal out of it. So it was always good. It was usually one of our bigger Sundays that we do, especially when you're bivocational and you're passing church and you're trying to figure out, with whatever limited resources we have, how can we still make big impacts in people's lives and have the time for doing evangelism. And I noticed my one church member would always leave. It was one of those things where you notice that this is somebody who I know that money is really, really tight with them. And if anybody could benefit for a free meal, it would be these people. So I didn't understand, why they would leave and everything else. I'm like, okay, so, and it wasn't like they just left and they went home and they made food. They left and they would go to a restaurant. So I'm thinking, you have all this good food here. And not only that, but you could even take some extras home with you. Like, why are you leaving to go pay money to go eat at a restaurant? Especially when I know that your money is tight,
Mm-hmm.
because they would reveal that information to me. So I think one time I just asked the question like, "Oh, how come you guys aren't saying?" And they just give me like a ho hum response, nothing out of the ordinary. And then probably that week, I get an email from the wife, and she says, "Hey, I have a question." I go, "Okay," and I'm like, "I have a question about what the Bible says about eating at a church." And I go, "Wait, huh?" so so the verse in question is the verse where Jesus talks about, consider the lilies of the field, consider the foxes, how God provides for them, or anything else. And she goes, where in the Bible does it say we don't have to eat at a church because God's going to provide food for us. And I'm like, what? And she goes, when I was growing up, her mom and dad told her that the reason why they would never go to a church meal, because in the Bible it says you're not supposed to, because God is supposed to provide for you. So having a church provide food for you, or provide food for everybody, and eating at a church is considered wrong and sinful. And I sat there and I go, you know, there is nothing in the scriptures that I am finding that explicitly says you cannot eat food in a church because God's going to provide food for you. Like, and then that's when she goes, oh, but isn't there some passage where Jesus talks about, you know, the lilies of the field and the foxes having homes and the birds having their nests? And I go, yeah, there is that verse, but nowhere within that verse Jesus is speaking in context that, hey, you're not allowed to eat food at a church, or that, hey, if someone is providing food for you, if it's a group of people just bringing a pot of bringing like a crock pot and you're sitting there and eating food, like, there's nothing, absolutely nothing that says that. And when I kind of mentioned that to her, I think there was one Sunday that they did come out and actually ate at the church, because I think and the main issue was why they weren't sticking around every fifth Sunday was because they believed that if they did, they would have been sinning against God, because they were eating food that the church was providing and not God providing, which I'm like, okay, like, so I don't know. Like, I just thought that was probably one of the wildest things I think I've ever been told. And I've been told lots of wild things in my lifetime in church ministry, but that was probably the wildest. But I think it just kind of goes to show you how sometimes when someone says something to you, it's always good to make sure you check it out first, instead of just kind of taking it at face value, assuming or taking it at face value, which kind of goes into our topic today, with just kind of crazy thing church leaders say, or church leaders have said, and why that's kind of and how that can kind of have a ripple effect on the people you minister, and just kind of your own perception or perspective about church life and church ministry. So so Micah, what is this kind of starts up? What is probably one of the, maybe the weirdest, or maybe one of the worst things that a pastor, or maybe like a church consultant, or somebody in church leadership had said that you're just like, that's kind of weird? Or maybe it's something you believed at first, you're thinking, oh, this is true, and then you realize, like, oh, this wasn't true, this is inaccurate.
I don't even know where to begin. Is it leaders, lay people, pastors?
Well, I want to stick necessarily with church leaders, and the reason why I say this, because sometimes the crazy things that laity have said sometimes is a regurgitation of what someone in leadership has told them.
Mm.
Like mostly 90% of the time, it's always that. It's always they say something, and I would say, like, oh, where'd you hear that from? And then they would say, oh, well, you know, this former church leader said it, or this pastor said it, or I heard it on a Christian talk radio from, you know, someone who says they're an expert in this, or, you know, just things like that, where it's like, oh, that's interesting. So I would kind of more specifically keep it to church leaders, because I feel like the things they say sometimes can be repeated and regurgitated through laity in the church.
Are we talking like people that we know, or are we talking about people like, or stuff that we've seen like online, or Because
It's
like,
whatever. I mean,
okay, so what?
because I mean, Micah, I'm sure between you and me, we probably have a ton of things that I mean, I've heard things through podcasts. People say stuff that I'm like, ugh. I've heard like I think probably one of the most recent things I've heard like on a podcast one time is somebody was talking about sheep, the church being sheep. And they're talking about church and they're saying like, oh, well, sometimes sheep bite. And but the funny thing is I remember I kept hearing this. So someone said this on a podcast, or maybe it might have been a pastor said this from a pulpit. And I don't want to like call out who I think it said it because I'm not 100% sure. But it was like a mega church pastor or a big Christian podcast, somebody. Well, then I'm seeing people talk about it, sharing it on social media about this quote and saying like, oh yeah, like people like resonated to it that at church hurt. And then out of nowhere, I see this farmer is like responding to this quote, and he goes, you do know that sheep are very docile. Like I shear sheep for a living, and not once have I ever been bitten by a sheep because I'm shearing their wool. Like they'll run around, they get scared, but I've never rarely see a sheep bite. And the only time a sheep bites is if they feel threatened and they're back in a corner and they need to get out. And then that's the only time they will bite, but they just don't bite unprovoked. They don't bite when you accidentally nip their skin with the shears. They kind of run. They don't bite. And I'm thinking, huh, from somebody who works with sheep all the time, I think I'm going to trust that guy's opinion than whatever this pastor said. Well, I mean, really, in all reality. So it's something like that where, it's something I've seen online, or maybe something that we've heard when we were in church leadership, or maybe we heard our pastor preach when we were growing up in the church, which I know for you, that'd be your dad. So.
He and I butt heads on a lot of things, and sometimes it's church God theology, for example. Great example of that is, the hymns are the doctrine of our faith, so we got to sing our hymns. How is that theologically relevant? Anyway, the one that comes to mind recently, I think, is you sent it to me on TikTok, Scott, but it was the whole Greg Locke thing where he had the debate
Oh
on
yes,
on
flat Earth.
on yeah, flat Earth, and he told the guy to just leave the church. Like, what kind of person does that? And
what type of person brings somebody to have a debate and then you don't like what they're
and then you
debating
kick him
about, so
out.
then you kick them out?
Yes, that was Greg Locke is one of those guys that I think just gets worse, right? Like, and what I mean by that is that, like, he was pretty controversial during the COVID days. We're going to have church, don't wear masks, we're not going to believe it, blah, blah, blah. Like, he was like the poster child for, what's the term they use on the news, like false information or fact checkers or
Yeah.
Misinformation. Like, he was like, yes, COVID was real. Yes, people need to make that choice of masking or staying home or whatever, right? I'm a believer that you can't make it, run your life or control your life, but like, you need to be respectful of other people. And he was just like, we're going to have church. And I'm like, well, great. You can have church. That's fine. Like, and then the whole flat earth thing where he invites this guy to his church to have a debate. And then he basically has the guy wasn't like being crude. The guy wasn't being disrespectful. The guy wasn't being, anything out of line, in my opinion, and yours. And, Greg Locke heard something he didn't like, and he was like, we're done. Get out. We're just gonna continue our service. Let's worship together. Like, made this huge scene in front of his whole church. they drag the guy out or escort the guy out, and it's like he didn't even do anything wrong. Like he may have a different opinion than you, and it was that just blew my mind. Like he just, and the fact that he just said like, you hear about all these things, and like specifically to this topic of all these pastors and leaders doing crazy outlandish things behind the scenes and not making it public. Like you only hear about it. But Greg Locke is like the opposite. He does it front and center right in front of his congregation. And
Yeah.
they see it. And this is a great example of that because he just goes completely off on this guy, has the guy escorted, and then acts like it doesn't happen. Hey, let's stand together and let's worship and let's keep going with our service. And then I think you told me, Scott, that they took it all down. Like they took it off their website, off of their live stream, off of their whatever. And it just proves that that was an issue. And of course, they'll blame it on the fact that what the guy was talking about was the reason they took it down. But like, come on, come on. What about you? Like, is there another one that you could think of?
Oh, geez. Well, I
I
think the
was
big
thinking those are more like that's like a more of an extreme example, I think, too, and stuff that we see like on social media. I think we lost you.
am I there now? Okay, good. Yeah, so I think one of the big things I see is, I mean, there's a couple of them, but I'll probably go with probably one that's like a little bit less conspicuous. I think I butchered that saying. I think I butchered saying that.
Conspicuous?
Thank you. I need more coffee, but um, there's this idea, especially within churches, especially maybe mid-sized, smaller churches that are stagnant. And when you're a pastor and you're in this thing of, okay, what do we do? A lot of times there are pastors who will say, okay, what can we do to reach our community? What can we do to kind of impact the culture for the kingdom of God? And usually that's kind of a good approach to what people with ministry does. But there are some people who go, well, what's going to make the church grow is if we just preach the gospel. What will make the church grow is if we just preach the gospel. And, I think this kind of goes back to the idea of using scripture to support your argument, and the idea of God's just going to make a church grow because we're preaching the gospel kind of comes from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians in chapter 3, verse 7, where it talks about God's the one who's going to bring the increase to the ministry. And I feel like even in that passage, that's going to be taken out. But the one question that I always, anytime when someone says that, the one scripture that I always kind of goes back to is the idea of James, going to the Gospel of James, where he talks about faith and saying, if you show me with somebody who has great faith but no action, I will show you somebody who has great faith and great action. And basically says faith without action is dead. And I think the idea that if you're in a mindset that, oh, we need to preach the gospel, and that's the only thing that's going to, and then by preaching the gospel, God's just going to miraculously grow our church. Well, true, you can have that faith, but what are you doing to live out the gospel in your community? Because you can preach the gospel all you want, but if there are people coming to your church who may not understand what you're preaching, or may have questions about how do you confirm gospel? Because like, I'm sure if you were to ask Greg Locke, hey, are you preaching the gospel? He's probably going to say, absolutely, I'm preaching the gospel. He may not be living the gospel, and I doubt he may be preaching the gospel. But But I think that comment
Well, I
is
mean, that's a great question, Scott. How many pastors are living the gospel?
yeah. And here's what I mean by living the gospel too. I think it's twofold. Like, hey, am I living according to the values and the teachings of Jesus Christ? Yes. And and I can say there are times where I do live according to the gospel. And then the times when I'm not, the times where I may be a little sharp with a church member, or times where I may be kind of, may have a bad attitude, or maybe just have like ill thoughts about, somebody who's criticized me in a staff meeting or or my sermon or whatnot. Um, I think when I'm in that phase where I'm not really living the gospel, I believe that if I am in tune with Christ and I'm in tune with the Holy Spirit, that when that happens and I'm able to say, that's not correct, I need to go and make things right. And I go and I apologize to that person that I may have been short with, or, I have to ask God to forgive me for thinking ill will about somebody, and try to really understand that person through their perspective, and maybe, not be so defensive, but kind of, you know, really assess things. And even at the end, if I assess things, I still think that they are wrong, then I still need to kind of encourage them and love them and minister to them, because not only am A, I'm their minister, but B, they are a person who is on their journey to try to connect with God in a very authentic way. And if I can lead that person to do that, then, I can't do that if I'm just harboring ill will against that person. And I think that's kind of a gospel living, that if I'm doing things good and I'm living out the gospel thing, but then when I'm kind of falling short, at least I feel like that I'm so in tune with the Holy Spirit that I'm convicted, and then I start to make that change. And I think that's gospel living, at least the way I see it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Man.
I mean, there's so many different examples you could think of. Like, um, and I think it's harder too, like the bigger churches that you have, like those pastors are like almost idolized in a way, right? Like, and what they say, like, you know, I think of you and me, like if we're pastoring smaller churches, smaller to mid-sized churches, we're, scrutinized for our everything. But like if you're in a bigger church, people follow you like a sheep, and they take everything you say. Um, and was it you that sent me something about Elevation Church?
There was something from Elevation Church. It was a thing about, there's something recently with Elevation Church.
They're not using the term,
They're not
was it?
using the term resurrection when they're talking about
Yes.
Easter. They are, and it's a the person who put this out does a lot of church leadership things, and kind of looks at like church websites and saying, hey, here's a good church website. Here, look at their things. So the whole platform is to try to educate people not only what's good to do, but a lot of times, especially mid-sized to small churches, they're like, well, what can we do that the bigger churches are doing? Which, part of me goes, maybe you should be looking at what the bigger churches are doing, depending on what it is. But it had to do with marketing, and basically the marketing person for Elevation, when they sent out invites to their community they're in North Carolina, right?
Yes.
So when they're sending it out to North Carolina, they're not using the term resurrection, because they're trying to get away from church, like, big church words, and they want to try to make it more. So basically, they'll talk about how, oh, come to Elevation Church, where you can where you can learn about how people's lives have been changed, where your life can be changed, or how people's lives have been changed on Easter, and the and all that sort of thing. So they're kind of getting away from the biblical language to resonate with people who may not necessarily have a biblical background or a church background. Because if I say resurrecting, they may not, or resurrection, they'd be like, well, what's that? That doesn't sound. Or, in old timey churches, oh, yeah, come and learn about how you can be saved from the blood of the lamb. And they're probably thinking, am I joining a cult? Are we going to be sacrificing sheeping there? Like, what's going on? Like, so that was kind of the big thing, is that they're not using church language to try to reach out to people, to get people in their community to come to church. Where since that video was posted, there's been a lot of criticism with that, a lot of criticism. But yeah, I did share that with you.
Yeah, I think that was just another example I could think of. I don't know, man. There's a number of ways you can go through this
Well,
this conversation.
I think the interesting thing that I find so fascinating, and I think it's a combination of a lot of viewpoints, and that kind of goes back to my question when you're asking me, like, well, what are we, kind of like giving you direction on what we're talking about, and are we talking about like random people that laity say? And because I'm sure there's a lot of weird things that laity say that is unprovoked or has not trickled down from somebody else. But the one thing, especially with small churches, the thing that I always hear that sometimes infuriates me as a small church pastor is the phrase, well, we are a smaller church, or we are a dying church. I find that, and I think to kind of go with that, there's a couple of other things that are attached to that. Like the last church I worked at, when I took that position, the one thing I did not see with that church is I never thought that this church was a declining or dying church. It was a bit smaller, but it was bigger than where I was. And as a pastor, and I think as a pastor, when you go into and you're candidating and you're looking at churches, for me, when I go into a church, I'm looking for really two things. Is this going to be a good fit for me and my family? And B, is there a possibility for growth based on kind of my skill set? Because there's been churches that, I've candidated at like mid-level sized churches before. And I even kind of said, like, oh yeah, this is a great church, has great facility, has a lot of great people in here that we can do a lot of things. But I'm looking at the location and I'm thinking, we're out in the middle of nowhere. And my big thing is building connections with community. And I really don't have a community out here. And plus, if everybody is driving 20, 30 minutes away to come to this church, how can I impact the community that I'm in if I don't have even a mayor or any type of local businesses that I can go and speak to and see how the church can support them or to encourage them or whatever. So, so it was one of those things where, like, I kind of was glad I kind of turned that church down, because I felt like, yeah, my family definitely would have been secure. We would have had a great place to live. We would have been in a very great area, but at the same time, like, I don't know what I could.
Kingdom advancement.
Yeah,
Like,
I
would
don't
you
know
have?
exactly. And I know there's probably some people who have probably a more rural background where they would be like, oh, I know what I can do with this. But for me, since I've mostly been in cities, bigger cities or smaller or small towns, like, that's kind of what I know. So I don't know what I would have been able to do. So it would have been a learning curve for me. But I think when people talk about a dying church, usually there's two things that kind of three things that kind of happens. The first thing is that, God doesn't expect small church pastors to be equippers. Equipping pastors are for larger churches. So when you're a pastor and you're coming into a smaller congregation and you're trying to build them back up, not just size, but also just by building up their spirit, encouraging them for kingdom work. When you have people who feel like, well, smaller churches are just for retired pastors who are there just to take care of this church until they finally decide to close their doors. And I know when Jeanette was on our show, when she talked about, times where she had to tell churches, hey, you're kind of dead. So here's your options. You can, you know, fold and then give all your money to an organization, or you can kind of just ride, maybe relocate and try to do do a church plant within your church, or you just kind of ride out your money until you have nothing left, and then that's it. And I feel like when there's that mentality that, oh, it's a smaller church, so we don't really have to grow, we're kind of in our, our aging stage where we're just want to be taken care of. We're in a hospice stage right now, or we're in a assisted living stage right now. And I feel like that's kind of a disservice to the smaller church. The other thing that I think frustrates me is sometimes when people say, well, we're a dying church. As a pastor, as a small church pastor, when you hear people in your congregation say that, you have the difficult task of trying to change that mentality. And, the last church I worked at, one of the early things that I was taught, probably like the first 2 years of being there, is that the previous pastor was frustrated with what was happening in the church and basically told the elder board that this is a dying church. A church of about, 80, 90 people. This is a dying church. And then left. And the elder board believed that, oh, well, this was just said in a meeting. Nothing got leaked out into, the congregation. Well, again, the pastor had certain individuals that they would always go out to lunch with, and had, had favorites, and this pastor would tell these people that, oh yeah, this is a dying church, and blah, blah, blah. So then a lot of times when I would sit with, church people, or I'd sit with like my board, and someone would say that, I have to like nip that in the bud, like real quick. I have to, because the problem is when you say that you're a dying church, usually there's two thoughts. There's usually two mentalities that go with that. We're a dying church, so it really doesn't matter what we do. We're just dying. So then that gives a lack of people wanting to participate in church life and help make the church grow. And not like grow in numbers, but just grow and just having a vibrant church life. So, if you have a small group, or if you have like a Sunday school, if you have something like that, oh, we don't want to participate, because why get involved in a group? Why care enough to be attached to something that is just going to be taken away? That's just going to die off. So we're just going to be complacent. We'll come to church, we'll give whatever we can, and then and then that's it. The second thing is there's people who care so much about the church, and they don't like seeing it in the state that it's in, because they're too busy reliving the glory days, that anytime when there is a change that happens, anytime when there has to be, and again, a lot of smaller churches, that they say, if the elder board's like, oh, we want to grow as a church, so let's hire somebody who's going to help us grow. And usually 9 out of 10 times they're hiring a young pastor to kind of give fresh ideas into a church to grow. And the battle is with a young pastor is they're doing new things that people don't like, or they're trying something, and then when it fails, or when you don't get the results that you were thinking, like, hey, we're going to do this big like carnival, and we're going to get all these inflatables, and we're going to give free hot dogs to everybody, and you do this carnival thing, and 15 people show up, and you bought 500 hot dogs, then you just lost money on this event. And then there's people going, oh, well, pastor did this, this was pastor's idea, and we need to get rid of pastor because he's destroying the church because he just cost us X amount of money, or the pastor's trying to do this change, and because of that, some people left the church because they didn't like it. So it's the pastor's fault. It's the pastor's problem. And those are usually typically, those are like the two mentalities. Either people are complacent and they don't want to do anything, or they want to find a scapegoat to blame everything on. And sometimes it may not even be pastors. I mean, there's times where I've worked at churches where I've had people say, well, I know when I first came to this church and I really enjoyed the church, and I was talking to someone, and this person said, well, yeah, this church isn't going to grow because of this person. And they would point out a specific member in the church because this person's a member of this church. And maybe because they were, whatever the case may be, why they would say that. But obviously they're saying but then it gets the question, well, if this church member leaves, then we would be growing. If pastor leaves, then we'd be growing. And I think in that mentality is very damaging. And for those of you who may be listening, who you're part of a smaller church, the big thing that I would give you is, if you believe that your church is a dying church and you believe that to your core, then you know what? Why do you still go? Because because really, if there's anything you should do, maybe you should leave and jump to a different church. Because if you have that mentality and that's something that you continue to keep saying, all you're doing is you're continuing to bring the church that you're a part of down, and you're not helping with trying to try to usher in the air of the Holy Spirit to bring new life into this church. And I think that's like my big takeaway. Because and plus, if you're a dying church, then why do you keep hiring a pastor to lead your church? Like, if you're a dying church, just say, okay, we're dead. Let's just shut the doors. Let's sell off the building. Let's take the money. Let's pour it back into a local ministry in our community. Let's give it to our state denominational offices. Let's give it to our national offices. Let's give it to our missionaries and be done with it.
You preach quite the sermon there, my friend.
I know. I have to stop doing that.
Well, it's good. And you'd be surprised at how many times I hear in our community, local churches go, we know what we are. We know we're a smaller church. We know we're not going to be around much longer. We know that we're dying. We know that and I'm like, you said earlier, Scott, with gospel living and things like that, and the mission of the church, like, God didn't call us to be complacent.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so disheartening to hear that so many churches are complacent, and to no fault of their own, or a lot of fault, they're just doing the best they can with what they've got. And that's not okay either. But it's just I would rather you be proactive, and, if the ship's sinking, at least you tried, right? Yeah. It's not like, oh, the church is paid for and we're just complacent and we're just going to wait till the last person dies and we can't pay the pastor anymore and we're just going to lock the doors and that's it.
Yeah.
That's go ahead.
Yeah, and kind of even with that mentality, the fact that, oh, well, if a church doesn't have any children or youth, then they're pronounced dead automatically. And but yet I can read a few stories where there were people who literally only had 8 people, had no kids. They're mostly like middle-aged or, retirees at this church. And the thing that they did is they just were like, well, let's do a vacation Bible school. Let's do some of these children events in the summer, and let's kind of encourage them. Let's do like a homework help thing where we could help kids with homework. And they went and they did these programs for children and youth. And then they started to get families coming in because they're like, oh, wow, look, this church really cares about the children in our community. And they were able to grow from that. And I think when a consultant or a church leader says, oh, well, you have no kids, so you're automatically a dead church, like, I feel like that's also bad. That's also bad theology or bad, just a bad practice, because if the heart of the people really care about doing evangelism, you can really make a connection. And even that, like, you think about churches in Florida, like, I know a lot of people who are retirees, they're snowbirds, they go down to Florida, and yet they have churches that are packed and they're just filled with older people. And they don't have kids, but they're thriving because they're part of a community where there's a bunch of retirees going on. And yeah, maybe you don't have any kids and maybe you struggle to try to get kids or kids program off, but what if you did a ministry where you were going into assisted living centers and doing church services there on a Sunday? What if you were doing programs where you were helping people who were aging, or maybe you have a program where you're helping families dealing with aging parents and parents who are, and you're kind of like the sole caretaker of your parents and you just need a support group, and this church was able to provide that for you. Like, the church can do a lot of things and can still grow and can still have thriving ministry happen that does not necessarily have to revolve around kids and youth. And just because a church doesn't have kids and youth programs doesn't necessarily it's pronounced dead because they don't have those programs. What I think pronounces a church dead is when, like you said, like, churches get complacent and they just kind of want to ride it out.
Yeah, it honestly breaks my heart when I hear my friends that are pastors. They're like, "Well, we just know what we are." I'm like, "Well, you could be so much more."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah,
But they're also, older, and they've, it's not right, wrong, or indifferent, but like they've just given up in a sense because it's like, well, I got a paycheck, the church is stable, and uh, we're just going to keep, doing the status quo and then hope people come to church on Sunday. And if we grow, great. If we don't, we won't. And that's not a great philosophy of ministry. And I think that, even coming out of the COVID days, like, oh, we'll blame it on the pandemic. People aren't coming back to church. I'm like, that was 4 years ago. And I know that people are still kind of, leery, and I'm not trying to downplay that at all, but like, it's just like, folks, uh, if that taught us anything, it taught us to reinvent the wheel, and it taught us to move ministry forward, and it taught us to think and do things outside the box where we never did it that way before, which is, the greatest, I think the greatest disservice to a church that you can do is say, oh, we've never done it that way before. Well, try it. If you lose money, you lose money. God's going to bless you and you're going to keep going. Don't just blame it on folks because they're not coming to church, or you're afraid to have a church in the park, or you're afraid to go outside the four walls of your physical church building, or
mm-hmm.
you're afraid to have a worship night, or you're afraid to have a movie night at the church because somebody's going to get mad about the movie you pick, or uh, let's have board game night at Scott's house, and like, let's just be in community. Like, that's what the Bible tells us to do,
Yeah,
right? And the church in Acts says they broke bread together. They did things together in their homes. They gathered together. And so, like, this whole idea that we're just complacent it breaks my heart to hear that. And it's like, you and I have talked about this several times, but like, the whole generation before us, they're so complacent and stuck in their ways. And then when they finally decide to give it up, hang it up, and retire, what's going to be left for us as leaders? Like, we're here to pick up the pieces, and it's just like, it's like a dysfunctional family, right? And like, it's broken, uh broken family after broken family after broken family. And you could use the same analogy with churches: broken church, broken home, broken church, broken home. And it's like, if you don't address the issue, it's only going to get worse. Like,
yeah,
that's the fact of the matter is. And then so many churches are just going to shut their doors because they're like, well, we're okay, everything's fine. Like the whole Eeyore mentality, right? It's okay, it's fine. Like, why is that okay? And then like we turned to state leadership and national leadership, and then they don't want to do anything. It's just a broken system all the way around. They're like, well, we can't help you. Well, then what are you there for?
Yeah.
Sorry, that was my soapbox. You had a soapbox, I had a soapbox.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. And I think, and I think that kind of goes, I mean, it goes to show, and I mean, I know this is going to sound another bad phrase I'm going to say, but we can't. No, let me go back. Sorry. The thing is what we say, we have to remember that if what we say, is it going to bring life or is it going to bring death? And
Right.
if the thing that I'm going to tell people is going to bring death, then two things are going to have to happen. Either A, I need to keep my mouth shut, first of all. And secondly, if I believe that to the point where I'm going to say that, then I need to leave.
Yeah.
Because I
Are you referring to you as the pastor?
for me as a church leader, whether I'm the
Okay.
consultant, because even if I was a consultant and I'm looking at a church and I'm going, man, I don't think this church has what it takes to survive. And all you see is death and gloom, then that may be one of the things where you may say, okay, like maybe I need to get somebody else in here with me to kind of maybe see things from a different perspective. So it's just not my, just not my set of eyes and what my knowledge of what we can do. Like maybe someone else who may has more of a specialty in like, I don't know, like country churches. They hired me, this
Mm.
country church hired me to go consult with them. I'm thinking, you guys are out in the middle of nowhere, you know, sorry, but your days are done. Or maybe I could have like or even if I have like another consultant, or even if I just have like a retired country church pastor going, hey, what do you see in this church? Because you lived out in the country, you probably know a little bit more about country life and country church life than I do. Do you think, what are some ways that this church, what are some practical ways that we can encourage this church to grow, or what are some good things that this church can do to really make an impact? And this person may have better ideas. I'm like, oh wow, that's a great idea. Like that's really wonderful. So I think even as a church consultant or a church leader, even an elder, like if you've been elected into a church leadership position and you just coming in with like a very cynical view of whatever, you're the one who's saying like, oh well, this church is dying, or this person's causing all the problems in the church, or this pastor's causing all the problems of the church. Um, then you may want to be like, okay, well, let's look at it. And maybe you might want to think like, well, let me back away. And I know the whole person in the church and church leader, that's a tricky, because you could have somebody, a church leader or a member of the church, who can be very toxic and can be really dragging down the life of the church. And if it's something that is a serious matter, then it's something that needs to be dealt with dignity and respect, but also with urgency as well. Um, but if it's just a pastor coming in and they're just trying to do something to kind of get life breathing back in this church, to try to get outside in their community, to get outside their doors, to really try to do what they can to really help the church out, and they're just hearing people going, oh well, you're screwing things up, you're doing things bad, then that's kind of defeating to your pastor. That's kind of defeating to your elder board, who's really working on trying to do something big, while they're hearing all this negative comments coming from people within that they worship with every Sunday.
Yeah. I think we kind of veered from our topic.
We did. I mean, we did, but I mean, we're still on there because we have to think about sometimes the crazy things that people say or church leaders say stems from, stems from a false belief. Sometimes I
Or
think
bad
it's
leadership.
bad leadership, or it stems from other people saying, giving bad quotes, and they're just regurgitating it, and it just continues to make a negative impact, and it just kind of taints the water.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, there's just so many things that I feel like our generation could learn a lot. A, from what we've seen, and B, from the folks that have modeled it before us.
Yeah. And I think it's funny because, and this is going to be way off topic, so I do apologize for those who are listening. But even when you look at like characteristics of generations, I have a buddy in my doctorate thing who's he's doing his doctorate project on postmodernism, and how he believes that there's a lot of good coming out in postmodernism that's going to kind of help revitalize the church. And what I find so fascinating is that there was a professor who's an older gentleman, an older professor, who absolutely hates postmodernism and believes that postmodernism is an evil, and he gives a compelling argument on why he thinks that is. But yet the student also gives a good compelling evidence on why postmodernism could be the thing that can really build the church up. And I think when you look at that aspect, or even when you look at generations, like, oh yeah, like we're seeing that Gen Z or Generation Alpha or Generation Z is becoming less and less religious. And sometimes, you could read those results, you could read that thing, and there's people going like, oh no, we got it. What are we doing? What are we going to do? And yet there's a part of me that goes, well, maybe that's okay. Maybe being less religious means we don't have all these like man-made rules that religion has put on there, and we can really get to the heart of the gospel.
I mean, we don't have it all figured out. That's okay. I mean, that was a rhetorical question.
I know.
I mean, yes. It's okay to not have it figured out.
Yeah. So I'm just going to kind of stop there because I feel like we could just start going on and on and on. But friends, what are some things that maybe you were told by maybe a church consultant, a church leader, a pastor, or anything else that's going on? Like, what were some things that you were taught and realized that this was bad advice, or this was a bad or a bad suggestion? Like, what are those things? We would love to hear it. You can send us an email at thescottstedman.com, or you can make a comment both on our YouTube page or even anywhere where you listen to podcasts. We love to hear from you guys. We love to hear your comments. And guys, thank you so much for listening. Hope you have a wonderful weekend. Have a wonderful Easter week, and we'll be back on next week with another episode. Take care. Thank you for listening to the Scott Stedman Podcast. The Scott Stedman Podcast is made possible by support from our listeners. We thank listeners like Patty and Scott, whose support goes to this podcast's continual growth and maintenance. If you want to support this podcast, you can do so in a number of ways. First, feel free to give us a 5-star rating if you enjoyed this episode and share it with your friends. If you'd like to financially support the Scott Stedman Podcast, you can go to the website ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman Podcast. That website again is ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.